let's move on to the rest of my commentary. In these last few pages, these last 3 or 4 pages, I want to turn my attention to another aspect of Yeshua's ministry while he was on earth, and the traditions that surround the events that took place. Now, we've already got the tradition of Passover that's been given to us in the Torah, and from that we have been given the tradition. I'm using the word tradition there because Passover is a commandment, but the details surrounding Pesach are not given. Therefore, if you've attended a traditional Seder in the past, and you've seen all the different things that take place at a Seder, with the washing of the hands, the eating of the bitter herbs, the maror, the urchatz, all the blessings and the drinking of the 4 cups, and the making of the Hillel sandwich, and all those different things, the telling of the story, the roasted shank bone on the plate, the dipping of the maror twice, the dipping of the bitter herbs twice, and things like that. Well, not dipping of the maror twice, but dipping of the parsley or the onion or lettuce or whatever it is, celery. To be honest with you, all of that is tradition that has been piled up on top of the commandment that says to observe the Lord's Pesach on the 14th of Nisan at the evening. So that's what I used the word tradition there. But we also have Yeshua's tradition that he handed to us on the night that he died, and that's that during that final Seder, that Chagigah, he actually instituted what the church now recognizes as communion, but which I would also recognize as a valid tradition given to his Talmidim, his disciples. It would be foolish for us, his Talmidim, to neglect that which he gave to us. To be sure, Shaul tells us that the things that Yeshua gave to him, he passes on to his own Talmidim in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 there, when he says, or chapter 10, is it 5 or 10? See, now you're going to make me go and look, aren't you? Here we go. Let me just pull it up here. It is chapter... It's not chapter 5. Sorry. I'm going to say that it is chapter 10. It isn't chapter 10. It's chapter 11, sorry. All right, but anyway, Shaul definitely says there in chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians that, I'll read it. He says, "For what I received from the Lord is just what I passed on to you." And he's talking about the communion details there with the elements, the bread, the wine. Really, it's a scaled-down Passover because it is a Passover. So those things we should be doing as believers, no question. However, if we examine the synoptic Gospels, if we look at the information that Yeshua has provided for us, and here's a reference that doesn't show up in my written commentary, but I want to give it to you now for those of you listening to the audio, okay? I want you to write down these passages. I want you to write down from Matthew. I'm just going to use the 4, and then I'm going to pull one from Paul. From Matthew, I want you to write down Matthew chapter... I should have written these down. Let me see if I've got them written down in my notebook here. Give me a second. Let's take a look. Is that? No. Let's take a look here. Here we are. I do have them written down. All right. I want you to write down these passages, okay? Matthew chapter 26, verses 17 through 29. Mark chapter 14, verses 10 through 25. Luke chapter 22, verses 7 through 23. And then John chapter 13, verses 1 through 30. Okay? And with those passages, I want you to also correspond to the passage in Corinthians that I was just mentioning. I want you to write down 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 through 34. Now, in these 5 references, what you're going to notice at a surface reading is that the themes in these passages carry one significant event in Yeshua's life. And I'll give you a hint. It's not his resurrection. Okay? So with that introduction, let's turn now in my commentary to this last section called Sunday Meeting, with a question mark there, meeting. Suppose the Sadducean Boethusian view is correct. Suppose Ariel's wrong. And suppose that the Omer Reisheet really starts on the morrow following the weekly Shabbat. In other words, the waving of the first sheaf occurs always after the weekly Sabbath. Let's suppose that that's the scenario. And that is, by the way, a view that many Messianics hold. It's a view that, and again, this is still a Jewish debate, because in Christian circles, they don't really concern themselves with the timings of the festivals, since mainstream Christianity has effectively divorced itself from those parts of the Torah, those parts that they label ceremonial. So this is really a Jewish debate, Jewish both in Messianic circles as well as Jewish in non-Messianic circles. But let's suppose that this is the view that the Torah is trying to indicate in the Leviticus passage that we started out with. This would put the festival on a Sunday every year. And indeed, we read earlier in my commentary from Levine, the JPS commentary to Leviticus, and he seems to present this exact view, the Boethusian view, because of its impact on Shavuot later on. What is the impact on us now as a Messianic community? How would we interact with this information if the resurrection, if Firstfruits, if Omer Reisheet, I keep saying Firstfruits, but I apologize, I'm trying to change my lingo from Firstfruits to Omer Reisheet. Firstfruits I'm going to now reserve for Shavuot, whereas Omer Reisheet, for Sheaf, I believe is reserved for the barley harvest. Firstfruits, as I understand it, would be the wheat harvest at Pentecost. All right, allow me to midrash in a different direction this time, okay? I'm about to step on some toes. I'm just going to say that in advance because I don't wish to offend anyone openly, but I do wish to challenge us, okay? There are 7 festivals mentioned on the biblical calendar of Leviticus 23. Each festival carries a similar aspect that ties it into the complete cycle of yearly gatherings, all right? We could say, as I've said in another place of my commentary, that the 7 festivals are the festivals. They are rehearsals, or really they're dress rehearsals of Messianic redemption. Each one of them carries with it an aspect of Yeshua's life, or his ministry, or his death, or his resurrection, or his intercession, or his second coming, or something like that, all right? In every single feast except one, we can observe that the instructions are, quote, to have a holy convocation. They are given that way. Now, technically, as Mark is fond of pointing out, Pesach does not bear this description, but I safely assume that the historical example of the inaugural Pesach in Egypt covers the technicality. In other words, we do gather together as a community each year in our homes. And so at a personal level, that's a convocation. But compare that to the language of the other ones in Leviticus 23, where God instructs the people to come together out of their homes and collectively gather wherever the leadership has designated them to gather, i.e. either the temple precincts or wherever. And we don't have the same language for every one of them. The one that is singled out as not being identified as a convocation or a gathering is the one that we're talking about right now, Omer Reisheet. Okay? You could ask yourself, what could the Holy One possibly be trying to convey to us here by not commanding a holy convocation? Now, the following explanation that I'm going to give you will serve as a personal midrash, a personal homiletic application on the calendar and the day that follows the Shabbat. It's not to be understood as the objective interpretation of the text. Rather, it is identifiably subjective. In other words, I'm going to give you my personal opinion as to the information I'm going to share with you. I base my understanding, however, on the objective findings of the text, okay? In other words, the text does not tell us to convocate on that Sunday, that ostensible Sunday, following the Omer Reisheet. All right? And here's why I think it doesn't. That's what I mean by objective and subjective. We all know that Israel was destined to be great among the surrounding nations, not great in her own right. Theirs was a call to holiness. Theirs was a call to servanthood. It was vividly demonstrated by their unique God-given calendar that they were to serve the rest of humanity. God was giving them the truth. God was giving them the words of life. And in this gift, He was expecting them to give this in witness, as it were, to the surrounding nations. You Bible students can reference Deuteronomy chapter 4 for that midrash there. Surely the many cultures and peoples that they interacted with had calendars of their own. Israel was not unique in creating a calendar. And each each unique culture had their special dates identifying their various holy days and such. Just like if you go from country to country today, you'll find that each nation has its own national Independence Day or whatever. Like America has Independence Day on July 4th. You go to other holidays and they celebrate the days that they were liberated from their slavery or days to commemorate when they had a great battle and they defeated the enemy and things like that. All right, there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's rather commendable of countries to do that, and I think it's great if you belong to a country that has such calendars days that you recognize them and be proud of that from where you can. However, Israel was supposed to showcase the heavenly reality. This was not Israel's calendar in and of themselves. It was not what's the word I want to use? It was not a locally autonomous calendar. Is that the word I want to use? I don't think so. There's a word that's I'm trying to think of. It was not indigenous to Israel, their calendar. That's the word I was looking for. Israel did not make it up on their own. God gave this calendar to Israel. And through the calendar, Israel was supposed to showcase the heavenly reality through the earthly means. And what were they supposed to be teaching everyone, including themselves? Well, among other things, they were to be teaching everyone that there was only one true God under heaven, worthy to be identified and worshipped as Creator. That's one of the things that they were supposed to be teaching. Israel was to teach the surrounding nations by their own lifestyle that, quote, God is one. Of course, that's a reference to Deuteronomy 6:4. Okay? During this period of the Tanakh, God usually worked out His truth by means of object lessons. That's how He taught His people. His children would, quote, do things which the surrounding nations were not doing. Similarly, His children would also abstain from the things which the surrounding nations were performing. See how that worked? God wanted them to be different. In this way, in this difference that they were trying to make, the surrounding nations would catch a glimpse of the difference between what God identified as clean and unclean, holy and profane, life and death. God is a God of differences. That's something we need to just camp out on and never, ever lose sight of that. God is not really about homogenization. God is not into mixing and matching everything together so that we can get a smooth mixture. If it has to be rough to be different, well then by golly it's going to be rough, and God's into differences. This was Israel's special call. In fact, the priests were also required to make this difference between the holy and the profane, life and death, good and bad, clean and unclean, light and darkness, etc., etc. This was Israel's special call, and as such, it identified her unique chosenness. We always think of Israel as the chosen people. What were they chosen to do? Well, they were chosen to do the very things I just mentioned. All right, read Deuteronomy 4, verses 1 through 20 specifically for this commentary. Read verses 19 to 20, and you'll see again that this is what I'm trying to hint at. Israel's call, by the way, is the church's call, lest some of you start saying, well, Israel was chosen to do one thing and the church was chosen to do... No. They have the same call, and we understand that. Israel's call and the church's call are identical, to make a difference in the world between the one true God and all other ostensible false or supposedly true gods, but in reality we know are false gods. The church has been called out, thus their term ecclesia, the church, the called out ones, just like Israel. The what is the Hebrew equivalent? I just drew a blank. The kahal, yeah, the kahila, the called out ones. Kahal is probably related to the Hebrew word call, which means voice. Kol, K-O-L, or Q-O-L. So Israel and the church, which is, of course, remnant Israel, right? They have this special call. And as such, we need to recognize the competition, all right? Israel's not just going to step into the land of Canaan and start giving out the truth where there was formerly no truth. The competition is that paganism has always been rife in the earth since man really set foot on the earth. I mean, Tower of Bavel says it all, right? Man trying to create his own way back to heaven. Man trying to create his own way to righteousness. And or trying to put forth some sort of righteousness that his self-created gods will identify with or accept. Sun worship is one of the oldest forms of paganism that exists in the earth today. Sun worship has been rife in the earth since the days of Bavel, the Tower of Bavel. All right, there's evidence to suggest that the ziggurats and the tower itself, the towers reaching into heaven, the ladders that reach into heaven, quote unquote, that these all give their credence or owe their allegiance to one form of sun worship or another, because the sun has been one of the chief deities throughout many pagan practices from the beginnings of time. And so the ancient myths, I'm just going to now mishmash through some of the details that many of you are familiar with, but for the sake of my commentary, I'm not going to put one particular name on these details, except for the name sun worship, all right? The ancient myths tell of a supernatural being, a Messiah type, born of a woman and born of the very rays of the sun itself. This supernatural being was supposedly killed by his enemies during the winter solstice, and only to be resurrected on the first day of the spring equinox. This interpretation arose out of the belief that the sun was in fact a god, small g-o-d, which slept in death during the cold winter months and arose to new life at the start of spring. In other words, the ancient pagan peoples, or the ancient people groups, without a proper knowledge of the truth of God and God's ways, were left to reinvent what they felt were the truths of the earth and the sun and the stars and the moon and all the signs of heaven. And so in their ignorance, the Torah teaches us that man worshipped the creation, the sun, the earth, etc., instead of the creator. Now, again, because the worshippers on the earth needed the sun's vital life-giving energy, they realized, of course, that life ceases to exist without the warmth and the light from this star, this sun. Without this energy, they realized that they would die, and so as in their reaction, they revered it as such in various pagan rites and rituals and ceremonies. Sun worship was therefore in many pagan cultures mandated for survival itself. It's no secret that ancient Rome was characterized by the sun cults that permeated her. Oh yes, the sun was a chief deity in ancient Rome as well as ancient Egypt and other cultures. One of the chief ceremonies in these pagan beliefs involved greeting the sun as it made its way victoriously back from the underworld of the dead during the first the break from the winter solstice into the spring solstice. Okay, we're talking about the vernal equinox. In fact, let me just look up here real quick the definition of vernal equinox. I want to give you a definition because I used a term that growing up I never fully understood myself. Vernal equinox. I'm looking it up on my online dictionary, so I can give you a dictionary definition. All right. Here is the dictionary definition. Vernal equinox. It's a noun. It's the equinox in spring on about March 20th in the northern hemisphere and September 22nd in the southern hemisphere. Did you see it there? The equinox in the spring. Now, what does that remind you of concerning the biblical feasts? Oh, Nisan is in the spring. We're starting to see the similarities, all right? So one of the chief ceremonies of these pagan beliefs is that the sun was held captive of sorts during the winter months, and now it's making its way back from the world of the dead, the underworld, as it were, and its followers would meet their deity as he made his reappearance from the wintry death that held him captive for a season. And guess what? The day chosen to represent this glorious awakening would become known as the first day of the spring equinox. And to ensure that the themes and the symbols would forever be established among their adherents, an unforgettable name was granted to this very special day. Thus, you could say, Sun Day was born. Interesting, isn't it? I'm just going to do this real quick. It's not in my commentary, but I'm going to pull up Wikipedia, that famous online resource. And I'm going to look up the term Sunday and see what happens, all right? This is just an experiment. I don't know what it's going to show. But you and I are going to find out together right now on the spot, okay? I look up Sunday, and here's what it says. Quote, this is from Wikipedia. This is not in the written commentary. This is just a bonus for those of you listening to my commentary. Sunday is the day of the week between Saturday and Monday. In Judeo-Christian tradition, it is the first day of the week. Since the second half of the 20th century, it has also been counted as seventh day of the week, as international standards have been agreed upon for overcoming technical barriers in worldwide commerce. In a number of countries, both counts run side by side. Sunday, they go on to say, is considered a holiday in most countries around the world as part of the weekend. Only countries influenced by Islamic culture often have Friday as weekly holiday instead. And they go on to say, down for the name Sunday, it says, quote, the name Sunday, and that's in quotes, day of the sun is in brackets, apparently originated in a pre-Christian Egyptian culture. They reference T. Slater's article on Sunday in the 1908 Catholic Encyclopedia. That's interesting. In Ptolemaic Egyptian astrology, the 7 planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon, there's 7. Yes, they considered the Sun a planet at the time. Each, well, not technically a planet, but an astrological body. Each had an hour of the day assigned to it, and the planet which was regent during the first hour of any day of the week gave its name to that day. They go on to say, quote, the Egyptian form of the 7-day week spread from Egypt to Rome during the 1st and 2nd century, when the Roman names of the planet were given to each successive day. Germanic-speaking nations apparently adopted the 7-day week from the Romans. Now, isn't that interesting? Who was the world power during Yeshua's day? Yeah, the Romans. Okay, let's keep reading. I'm not trying to say that everything that Rome does is wrong. That's not where I'm going with that. We're just talking about history, okay? Anyway, Germanic peoples apparently adopted the 7-day week from the Romans so that the Roman Dies Solis became Sunday. In German, it's Sonntag. The Christians reinterpreted the heathen name as implying the sun, S-U-N, of righteousness with reference to his arising out of Malachi 4:2. It was also called Dies Panis, Day of Bread, because it was an early custom to break bread on that day. Interesting. If I were to keep reading or doing other links to Sunday, we would again see that Sunday bears a connection to the sun cults and the sun worshippers of days gone by. So, at this point in my commentary, it should be rather obvious by now that the event that I'm describing, greeting the sun as it made its way back from the underworld of the dead, that this bears a remarkable resemblance to our modern-day Easter celebration. And again, it should, and this should be no surprise, since the origins of Easter can indeed be traced back to this very legend. Let's pull a Wikipedia again, all right? This time I'm going to look up the word Easter, E-A-S-T-E-R. And here's what we find. Easter, again from Wikipedia. Easter, the Sunday of the resurrection, Pascha, or Resurrection Day, is the most important religious feast of the Christian liturgical year, observed at some point between late March and late April each year. In parentheses, they say early April to early May in Eastern Christianity. It celebrates the resurrection of Jesus, which his followers believe occurred on the 3rd day after his death by crucifixion, sometime in the period AD 27 to 33. Then if we jump down to etymology, let's see, where do I want to pull it up? Date of Easter, computations, Western Christianity, Eastern Christianity, Western Christianity, Eastern, let's see, and then they give some other countries, Easter controversy, etymology, and the origins of Easter traditions. Let's look at that real quick. In his De Temporum Ration, I think I pronounced that right, I think that's Latin, the Venerable Bede, or Bede, wrote that the month Oestromonat, is April, was so named because of the goddess Oestra, or Eestra, as I've heard it pronounced, is where it's spelled E-O-S-T-R-E. Oestra is what I've heard the best pronunciations. Who had formerly been worshipped in that month. In recent years, some scholars have suggested that the lack of supporting documentation for this goddess might indicate that Bede, or Bede, assumed, it's B-E-T-E is his name, assumed her existence based on the name of the month. Others note that Bede's status as, quote, the father of English history, had been the author of the first substantial history of England ever written, might lack the additional mention for a goddess whose worship had already died out by Bede's time, unsurprising. They go on to say, that some suggest an etymological relationship between Oestra and the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. The variant spelling would be Eshtar, with an E instead of an I there. And the possibility that aspects of an ancient festival accompany the name, claiming that the worship of Bel and Astarte was anciently introduced into Britain, and that the hot cross buns of Good Friday and dyed eggs of Easter Sunday figured in the Chaldean rites just as they do now. Finally, it goes on to say, quote, claiming a connection between Ishtar and Easter is an example of false etymology and ignores the fact that Easter is called Passover in almost every other language of the world. The only exceptions appear to be the languages of those people who first learned Christianity at the hands of English or other Anglophone missionaries. Examples of this are the Hebrew Pesach, the Greek Pascha, the Latin Pascha, the Italian Pasqua, the French Paques, the Spanish La Pascua, and the Scots Gaelic Ancasca. The holiday was not called Easter until the 8th century, by which time it had already been in existence for 700 years. Now, end quote, by the way. Excuse me. I don't know if Wikipedia there is trying to mask the truth that there is a relationship between the pagan celebration and the Christian innovation of Passover, but what we do know for certain is that there is a relationship between Easter and Passover, and that's undeniable. How detailed you want to get between those comparisons is up to you. But let me go ahead and continue in my commentary and say this much, all right? Christianity, in its infancy, swelled to overflowing with former pagans in an effort to establish itself as a viable religion in the 3rd and 4th centuries. It's probably even earlier than that. That's a modest figure there when I say 3rd and 4th. It was misunderstood that Judaism had failed, okay? In my commentary, I put the word mis in parentheses because according to Christianity, Judaism had failed, so therefore it's their understanding. But we understand as studying the Torah that it's a misunderstanding. Judaism had not failed in that sense. But Christianity teaches, at least ancient Christianity did, modern Christianity today seems to be coming full circle and realizing that there have been many mistakes in their treatments of the Judaisms down through the years. So Baruch Hashem, bless you, modern Christianities, for coming full circle. For those of you who are coming out of darkness back into light. Anyway, Christianity misunderstood that Judaism had failed, and that in its lack of recognition of the Messiah placed it in a place less favored, nay, rejected, by the Holy One himself. How many of you listening to my commentary have heard the common notion or common teaching that Judaism rejected Jesus and therefore God rejected Judaism? Or to put it more bluntly, the Jews rejected Jesus, so God rejected the Jews. And in the rejection of the Jews, God chose for him a new people group called the church, viz. The Gentile Christians. You've heard that? Raise your hand. Yeah, I can see all those hands around the world being raised, those people listening to my commentary. That's a shame, people. That's a very sad commentary on the history of God's dealings with his people. God did not reject Israel. Paul says so in Romans chapter 11. At any rate, looking back, in this caricature painted by historic Christianity, Christianity would take its rightful place, ostensibly, among believers as the, quote, true expression of Christ worship, end quote. Now, looking back in 2020 hindsight, we can understand today that this paradigmatic shift was not entirely complete, nor would it be permanent. It was, in fact, a shifting of responsibility. I don't want to negate the fact that God was doing something new within the Gentile elements of remnant Israel. There is a newness about the apostolic scriptures that we need not argue over. I've heard Messianics go to the nth degree to try to explain that Jesus introduced nothing new, that his followers, the Talmudim, Shaul and such, introduced nothing new to the people of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and 4th centuries and following. But that's not entirely accurate. There is some innovation taking place, and there is a shifting responsibility of sharing the good news with the surrounding nations, which placed Israel in this position of, quote, less favored. It does say that in Romans 11, that a temporary blindness has come on part to Israel. And in this blinding, the Gentiles are being shown the light, and in this revelation, the responsibility is being taken up again. It's like a passing of the baton, but without leaving the other runner behind. It's, in my example, the passing the baton. The Gentiles pick up the baton where the Jewish people have been running for so many years, but eventually it's just to give the Jewish people kind of a reprieve, as it were, while God works with the second runner. And eventually the second runner is supposed to come back and revisit the first runner so that the two can run together once again. The students of my commentary should familiarize themselves with Romans chapter 11, as I keep mentioning. But like Israel of old, the young Christian church would make many significant mistakes, and mixing paganism with truth would become one of her errors which would permeate the very fabric of the formalized church. Like tzara'at, like leprosy, okay? Down to this day, the church has been stained by the pagan mixtures, by what we call syncretism, by mixing the good with the bad, and failing to make a distinction between the holy and the profane. The very thing that Israel was accused of doing for centuries before the exiles was that she had a penchant lust for idolatry, and she would also do the same thing. One day she would worship the one true God by ostensibly bringing sacrifices out of an ostensible true heart. And the next day she's bowing her knees at the altars of Baal. And God was not happy. God was not fooled either, by the way, okay? He was not saying, okay, that's great, you're worshiping me. I'm just going to look the other way when you go to the altars of Baal. Not in your life. Well, guess what? Christianity has been dabbling with paganism for nearly 1900 years, 2000 years. Isn't it time we get rid of those things? Come on, people, put away the paganism. I'm getting upset here now, I apologize. In this historical narrative that I'm describing, it's great that the Gentile elements of Christianity embraced Jesus as the Christ. But by synchronizing and syncretizing paganism with the truth, much damage has been done. The pagans within the Christian ranks, I'm not just going to blame it on them, but the numbers were swelling, and it was very hard to distinguish true pagans from true believers, and vice versa. And the pagans, as I like to see it, brought their worship of the sun into Christianity, or conversely, the genuine Christians begged for the pagans to bring it in. Either way, paganism was brought into Christianity, sun worship was brought into Christianity, and its traces can be observed even today. For instance, Easter, just like Wikipedia recognized there, or mentioned there, is rightly recognized as, quote, the holiest gathering within Christianity. Billions of followers flock to sunrise services all over the world to do what? To pay homage to the true S-O-N who was resurrected on this day, and rightfully so. Jesus was risen from the dead and recognized on the first day of the week. Were it not for the awesome resurrection of our Lord Yeshua, which I'm not trying to minimize, please don't put words in my mouth. Were it not for his resurrection from the power of death, we believers, both Jew and Gentile, we would have no hope in this world, okay? It would be hopeless to follow this Messiah. However, he did resurrect. Moreover, he did defeat death on that day. And we do have a reason to celebrate. But do we have a biblical injunction to gather on this particular day? That's my question. That's my challenge. It is my premise that we do not. Our theology seems to be correct, yet our methodology lacks authenticity. The way in which we are doing and going about this is all wrong. Consider my example in my commentary from the book of Ezekiel chapter 8. I'm on page 11 of my commentary, okay? I'm almost done. Hang with me. Stick with me. Don't tune me out just yet. This is a reading from Ezekiel chapter 8, I'm just going to read a very significant quote, all right? Quote, "In the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day, while I was sitting in my house, and the elders of Judah were sitting before me, the hand of the sovereign Lord came upon me there." This is Ezekiel writing, right? Remember, Ezekiel was a priest. "I looked and I saw a figure like that of a man. From what appeared to be his waist down, he was like fire, and from there up his appearance was as bright as glowing metal. He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God he took me to Jerusalem, to the entrance to the north gate of the inner court, where the idol that provokes to jealousy stood. And there before me was the glory of the God of Israel, as in the vision I had seen in the plain. Then he said to me, 'Son of man, look toward the north.' So I looked, and in the entrance north of the gate of the altar I saw this idol of jealousy. And he said to me, 'Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The utter detestable things the house of Israel is doing there, things that will drive me far from my sanctuary? But you will see things that are even more detestable.' Then he brought me to the entrance to the court. I looked, and I saw a hole in the wall. He said to me, 'Son of man, now dig into the wall.' So I dug into the wall and saw a doorway there. And he said to me, 'Go in and see the wicked and detestable things they are doing there, or doing here.' So I went in and looked, and I saw portrayed all over the walls all kinds of crawling things and detestable animals, and all the idols of the house of Israel. In front of them stood 70 elders of the house of Israel, and Jaazaniah, son of Shaphan, was standing among them. Each had a censer in his hand, and a fragrant cloud of incense was rising. He said to me, 'Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the darkness, each at the shrine of his own idol? They say, the Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken his land.' Again he said, 'You will see them doing things that are even more detestable.' Then he brought me to the entrance to the north gate of the house of the Lord, and I saw women there mourning for Tammuz. He said to me, 'Do you see this, son of man? You will see things that are even more detestable than this.' He then brought me into the inner court of the house of the Lord, and there at the entrance to the temple, between the portico and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs towards the temple of the Lord, and their faces towards the east. They were bowing down to the sun in the east. He said to me, 'Have you seen this, son of man? Is it a trivial matter for the house of Judah to do the detestable things they are doing here? Must they also fill the land with violence and continually provoke me to anger? Look at them, putting the branch to their nose. Therefore I will deal with them in anger. I will not look on them with pity or spare them. Although they shout in my ears, I will not listen to them." End quote. What a powerful passage. I get chills down my back reading that information, and I hope it should strike you as shocking as well. What in the world is Israel thinking? Standing with their back to the temple and their faces towards the east, bowing down to the sun in the east, greeting the sun? Oh yes, people, make no mistake, it's sun worship. So apparently, sun worship was even being practiced by Am Yisrael. Oy vey! Oy vey! Exactly how low had God's chosen people fallen? It's a sad legacy being recorded there by Ezekiel. The traceable pattern to disobedience and error looks like this. First, man misunderstands God's purposes. It says in the passage up there that the people thought that God had forsaken his land because of the exile that they were experiencing. Remember, Ezekiel was in exile, and he's transported by the Spirit back to his home city of Jerusalem. So the people are in exile, and they're in exile, and the remainder of the people who are left there, at least in Ezekiel's vision, say, God has forsaken his holy city. God has forsaken the land. God hadn't forsaken the land. God was punishing the people for their idolatry. Yet the people were misunderstanding God's punishment. So that's the first step in error and disobedience. Man misunderstands God's purposes. Then, man misunderstands God's methods. A lack of understanding of sanctification and true worship resulted in blatant disobedience of the Torah and eventually gross idolatrous practices. Go back and read verse 17 through 18 again, all right? It is a shame that the people were doing this in God's house. It's a shame that they were doing it at all. But to bring the pagan mixture into the house of God is what grieved the Spirit of God so much. God wishes that we were either hot or cold. But because we are lukewarm with our pagan mixtures, our syncretism, you know what God says? And you've read it in Revelation. God will spew us out of His mouth. I believe that the organized body of Messiah of the 21st century, the church, is not far behind Am Yisrael in this passage. The damage has been done. Today, in fact, as I'm recording this commentary on Saturday, the 7th of April, but the 19th of Nisan, tomorrow is Easter Sunday. The 8th of April, first day of the week, is Easter Sunday 2007. And I'm ashamed to admit, people, that I will not be surprised to find multitudes of professing believers in Jesus flocking to sunrise services throughout the entire world. The damage has been done. Today, and again, Judaism is not exempt, but right now I'm just singling out the church for this message that I really feel that the Spirit is telling me to tell you. Today, tradition still blinds us to the unchanging truth of God's Word, a truth that should not be compromised. The world is watching us believers. Oh yes. We may not know it, but they're watching. Someone is always watching. They're observing whether or not we will make a difference between the clean and the unclean, the holy and the profane. They're watching to see if we will demonstrate the truth between life and death. HaShem did not tell Am Yisrael to gather on Yom HaBikurim, on the day after the Shabbat, which according to the Sadducees is Sunday, Yom on Omer Reisheet. God did not tell Israel to gather there. He only told the priests to get together and to wave the Omer Reisheet, the first sheaf. I believe that God told Israel not to gather on this day after the Sabbath in order to separate His truth from the error of paganism. Remember, sun worship predates Judaism. It predates what Moses gave to us in Leviticus 23. That's not to say that error came before truth. Truth came first. But the perversion of truth was existing in the days of, well, existed all the way back to Bavel. All the way back to Babel, okay? All the way back to Babylon. I believe that the people of the Tanakh set the biblical example for us today, not to gather on that special Sunday during the Passover week for a true heavenly reason. God was instilling within them special truths that they were to demonstrate to the people groups around them by not gathering together on this Sunday. And again, I'm saying Sunday because, again, that would be the Sadducean view, the Boethusian view, that has Omer Reisheet falling on the day after the weekly Sabbath, instead of falling after the festival Sabbath like I believe it should be. Why have we, the followers of Jesus, failed to grasp this truth? Surely Yeshua was raised from death to life on that morning following the Sabbath. I am not negating that central truth. we must recognize a risen Yeshua, or he is no Messiah at all. Surely he is the firstfruits from the dead. That's what my Bible tells me. He is the first person, the first human to be raised unto a resurrection of incorruptible flesh. Amen. Although our flesh still houses sin, his flesh was sinless before his death on the execution stake, and his resurrection demonstrates for us, genuine believers, what a resurrected body will be made like. Raised to life everlasting. Hallelujah. In my conclusion, then, I have to ask the body of Messiah, please listen to me today. Why then do we continue to confuse this wonderful truth with our man-made tradition of sunrise services, Easter bunnies, Easter rabbits, Easter eggs, the whole Easter shebang? Why do we do it? Why don't we return to the biblical truth as outlined for us in the pages of God's holy Torah? Isn't it time we start demonstrating his holiness to the rest of the world by the very days that we gather on? I think it is. After all, remember what I stated at the very beginning of my commentary. The first always belongs to HaShem. So why are we sharing it with paganism? Consider these words. With that, I greet you. Chag Sameach Omer Reisheet. Happy festival of the first Sheaf. For further study, I'd like you to read my commentary. I'd like you to read the Bible, which are much better than my commentaries. Read Exodus chapter 23, verse 16 and verse 19, as well as Exodus 34:26. Read Leviticus 2, verse 12 and verse 14, as well as chapter 23, verses 20. Read Numbers chapter 18, verses 12 through 15, as well as verse 26. Read Deuteronomy 18, verses 1 through 5, and chapter 26, verses 2 through 4, and verse 10. Read 2 Chronicles 31:5. Read Nehemiah 10, verse 35 through 39. Read Proverbs 3, verse 9. Read Jeremiah 2:3. Ezekiel 44:30 and chapter 44 of Ezekiel and verse 14. Read Malachi 3:8 through 14. Read Matthew 13:37 through 39, Mark 4:26 through 29, Hebrews 6 verse 20, Hebrews 7 verses 1 through 8, and Hebrews 12 verse 1. Read Jude 14, and finally read Revelation 1 verse 7. I love you all. Thank you for your prayers and for your support. Continue to pray for me and continue to support me by visiting our website at graftington.com, reading the commentaries, downloading the MP3s, subscribing to iTunes, grabbing all the audio content. It's all for you. It's free. Take it, use it, utilize it. Please don't change it without asking me. But give it out to your friends and family and anyone else who wants to do more extensive studies on the biblical truths that we're learning in these commentaries. Okay? Again, I love you all, and I wish you all a very well and happy counting of the Omer. Stick to the count, people, because in 50 days or so, a most wonderful thing is going to happen, and I don't want you to miss it. I'm going to be there. Our Lord will be there, and I'm looking forward to seeing you there as well, okay? Shalom. That concludes our show for today. Remember, because the Messiah has already come, the Torah is now a document meant to be lived out in the life of a faithful follower of Yeshua through the power of the Ruach HaKodesh to the glory of God the Father. It should not be presumed that it can be obeyed mechanically, automatically, legalistically, without having faith, without having trust in HaShem, without having love for God or man, and without being empowered by the Ruach HaKodesh. To state it succinctly, Torah observance is a matter of the heart, always has been, and always will be. My name is Torah teacher Ariel ben Lyman Hanavi. The intro and outro song was produced and performed by Ryan Kingsley. For information on contacting Ryan, you can reach me by email at yeshua613@hotmail.com. That's YESHUA number 613@hotmail.com. Or visit our website at graftedin.com. That's graftedin.com.